"Hurry up and die, Raphael. My lawyers are almost done with the papers." Vanessa Crane whispered those words into the ear of the man who had given her everything. His engagement ring, his trust, and an entire shadow empire stretching across the docks of Providence while he lay motionless in a hospital bed, his eyes drowned in darkness, unable to see her smiling. But what Vanessa didn't know was that Raphael Bianchi heard every single word. What she didn't know was that for days the darkness before his eyes had begun to lift, and he lay there in silence, memorizing every voice, every footstep, every lying promise. She thought she was leaning over a blind man about to fall. She was leaning over the most dangerous crime boss this city had ever raised, and she had just lit the fuse on her own destruction. Because into that darkness, a stranger had stepped in, not knowing who he truly was, but knowing only that he shouldn't be left alone, and that simple choice would change everything. If you love stories of betrayal and payback, hit that like button to keep this channel going. Don't forget to share this video with someone you think will hold their breath until the very end. And subscribe right now so you never miss the ending no one could ever see coming. That night, Providence Harbor lay drowned beneath the cold mist of October, and no one in the city knew that within mere seconds, an entire empire would be shaken to its very foundations. The gleaming black car moved slowly past the rows of warehouses along the waterfront, where Raphael Bianchi had controlled every inch of the shoreline for nearly 10 years. And inside the driver's compartment, Nico Ferraro sat upright behind the wheel as he always did, careful, composed, and faithful with every breath he took. Nico had driven for Raphael for 7 years. He had carried him safely through 3 bloody purges, had learned how to remain silent in moments when a single careless word could cost a man his life. And that night, he performed his duty exactly as he always had, never imagining that this would be the final journey the entire city would speak of for years to come. Raphael sat in the back seat, staring out at the black water, his mind occupied with numbers and names, when the car turned into the curve near Pier 7. Without warning, the ground seemed to split apart beneath a deafening roar. A wave of unbearable heat hurled everything into the air, and Raphael's world shattered into darkness in the space of a heartbeat. As flames clawed their way into the night sky, people whispered that no one could possibly have survived an explosion like that, and the news spread faster than the smoke itself. Raphael Bianchi had fallen, and rumors spread that his loyal driver had perished beside him. A rain that had lasted nearly a decade had come to a sudden halt on a single cold and misty night along the waterfront, but the city was wrong, at least by half. 3 days later, in a hospital room heavy with the sharp smell of antiseptic and silent as the bottom of a well, Raphael Bianchi opened his eyes. The first thing he felt wasn't pain, nor was it the relief of a man who had escaped death. It was darkness, a dense and absolute night through which not even the faintest thread of light could pass, covering his eyes as though someone had lowered the final curtain over the world. He lay motionless, listening to the sound of his own breathing, listening to the steady rhythm of the machines beside him. And in that first terrible moment, the man who had once forced the most powerful figures in the city to bow their heads realized that he couldn't see the hand resting directly upon the white blanket. The doctor spoke to him in a careful, measured voice, explaining that the trauma to his head had damaged his vision, that it was far too early to know whether the blindness would be temporary or permanent, and that he needed time, quiet, and patience. Raphael listened to every word with the unmoving expression of a man who had spent a lifetime concealing everything that raged beneath the surface. They told him he was fortunate, that the force of the explosion had thrown him clear of the most severely damaged section of the car, and that half a second later, there would have been nothing left to save. But Raphael didn't believe in luck. He never had. In the world where he had lived and ruled, luck was merely the name naive people gave to things they weren't sharp enough to understand. The longer he remained still in the darkness, the more certain he became that something was wrong. It was a vague but relentless feeling, gnawing at him from within, because he knew that road, he knew that car, and he knew how carefully Nico drove. A vehicle maintained down to the smallest bolt didn't simply turn into a ball of fire in the middle of a familiar curve. He thought of Nico, of the man who had been sitting less than a meter away when everything exploded, and a chill traveled slowly down his spine. It wasn't the chill of fear. It was the cold touch of a question that had no answer. Someone had wanted him dead. That much was obvious. But the question that kept him awake in the darkness wasn't who had carried out the attack. It was who had been close enough, trusted enough, and intimate enough to know exactly which car he would be sitting in, at precisely what time, and on exactly which road. Raphael Bianchi lay there blind and motionless between four cold white walls, and while the entire city beyond them believed his story had ended, something began to awaken in the deepest part of the man who had built an empire with nothing but his own two hands. It awakened quietly, patiently, and with a danger greater than any weapon, because he understood that someone believed they had buried him inside this darkness, and he intended to let them keep believing it. In the darkness, when one sense is taken away, the others seem to rise of their own accord to fill the emptiness, and Raphael Bianchi quickly discovered that his ears had now become the sharpest weapon he possessed. He lay motionless in the hospital bed, and within the silence everyone mistook for unconsciousness, he began to hear the world in a way he had never bothered to notice before. He heard the wheels of a cart rolling through the corridor 3 doors away from his room. He heard the footsteps of each nurse, and learned to distinguish who walked quickly and who moved slowly. He even heard whispers slipping through the narrow opening beneath the door, spoken by people who believed they had lowered their voices enough. The injury had stolen the light from him, but it seemed to have honed his hearing to an almost superhuman degree. And Raphael, a man who had always known how to turn weakness into advantage, quietly accepted that strange gift without revealing the slightest sign. That was why he heard, clearly, and down to every syllable, the phone calls Vanessa Crane made, just outside in the hallway, only a few steps from his room, where she believed the wall and the half-closed door were enough to keep her words hidden. Vanessa's voice beside his bed was soft as velvet, sweet, and filled with concern, but the voice she used in the corridor was something else entirely. It was cold, precise, and efficient. The voice of a woman managing a business transaction rather than waiting for the man she loved to awaken. On the 4th day, he heard her tell someone over the phone, in a tone so calm it was chilling, that the succession clause gave them 60 days, that the clock had already begun counting down, and that as long as everything was arranged in the proper order, no one would be able to stop them anymore. 60 days. Raphael silently carved that number into his memory, along with the deliberate way Vanessa emphasized each word, as though she had memorized this script long before he ever fell. Then, later that same day, he heard a name slip quietly from her lips, softly spoken but still clear enough to reach his straining ears. Bishop Kane. It was a name Raphael knew very well, the name of a man who had spent years coveting everything Raphael possessed, a man who stood on the opposite side of every secret agreement made along the harbor, a man whose name alone was enough to make every scattered piece inside Raphael's mind begin to turn and lock together into a shape he didn't want to see but could no longer refuse to face. Vanessa and Bishop Kane, 2 names that should never have appeared in the same sentence, had now been spoken by the woman wearing the ring Raphael had placed upon her finger, and he lay there with his face as still as the surface of a frozen lake, while beneath that ice, an entire current raged and twisted. He didn't allow himself to become angry, because anger was a luxury reserved for men without a plan. And Raphael always had a plan, even while blind, even while lying helpless in a hospital bed with a body that still refused to obey his commands. Instead, he did what he had done throughout his entire life. He listened. He remembered. He waited. He turned every phone call that accidentally reached his ears into a piece of evidence, and every one of Vanessa's footsteps in the corridor into a trail she had no idea she was leaving behind. He memorized her rhythm, the hour she arrived, the hour she left, the way her voice changed whenever a doctor was nearby, and how different it became when she was alone with nothing but the telephone. The more he listened, the more clearly he understood that the woman he had once intended to marry wasn't grieving, wasn't frightened, and wasn't praying for him to wake. On the contrary, she was counting every day and every hour, waiting for the moment when he stopped breathing so that every document could be signed, and no one would remain to stand in her way. In his silent world, Raphael Bianchi came to understand a truth colder than death itself. The person who had betrayed him wasn't hiding somewhere beyond the walls in the night. She was sitting right beside his bed, holding his hand, and whispering false words of love into the very ears that could now hear through every lie. On the 5th evening, after the sound of Vanessa's high heels had completely disappeared at the far end of the corridor, and the room had settled into the kind of silence Raphael was beginning to know well, another sound reached his straining ears. It wasn't the cold, sharp tapping of heels against the tiled floor like the thrusts of a knife, but the soft footsteps of low-heeled shoes, slow and unhurried, the footsteps of someone who had nowhere more important to be than in this very room. The door opened quietly, and a voice rose through the stillness, warm without being forced, gentle without being false, a voice that spoke to him as though he were still a human being, rather than a body waiting to be taken away. The young woman introduced herself as Cora, the night nurse, and what immediately caught Raphael's attention wasn't what she said, but the way she said it, because she spoke to him as though she expected an answer, as though his silence were only temporary rather than a permanent sentence, as though he were still there, still listening, still worthy of being treated like a human being. Her hands were steady and careful when she adjusted the pillow beneath his head. It wasn't the careless motion of someone merely trying to finish a task, but an act of genuine care. And when she pulled the blanket up over his chest and softly told him that he would be more comfortable that way, she said it for him, not for herself, not to appear devoted in front of someone else, but because whether or not he was comfortable truly mattered to her. Raphael, who had spent an entire week listening to false declarations of love spoken in Vanessa's carefully practiced sweetness, now lay still and recognized the difference between the two women as clearly as light and darkness, because one performed concern to conceal the knife behind her back, while the other gave her care freely, expecting nothing in return, and not even knowing who the man beneath her hands truly was. Then something Raphael hadn't expected occurred, because instead of leaving after completing her duties like every other nurse, Cora pulled a chair closer to the bed, sat down, and began to read. She didn't ask permission. She simply took out an old book with a worn spine, opened it to the page marked inside, and began reading aloud in an unhurried and completely sincere voice, the voice of someone reading because she herself wanted to read, not because she was putting on a performance of tenderness for anyone to witness. It was a story about the sea, about an old man and his solitary struggle in the vastness of the ocean, and as her voice flowed steadily across the pages, Raphael suddenly remembered something he had buried for decades. He remembered the days when he had been a poor boy in the old harbor district, hiding from the winter cold in a corner of the public library because it was the only place where warmth was free, and he had read this very book while curled up on a wooden chair, forgetting his hunger and the cold for a few brief hours. He hadn't thought of that moment in nearly 30 years. He had buried it beneath layer after layer of power, money, and the cold-blooded hardness life had forced him to wear. Yet now, through nothing more than the reading voice of a nurse he had never met, an entire part of him that he had believed long dead quietly stirred back to life. Cora read for 40 minutes, never knowing that every word she spoke was touching a place deep within him that no one had reached in many years. And when she closed the book, she softly said that she would return at the same time tomorrow if he didn't mind, that she knew he might not be able to hear anything. But silence wasn't a very good companion anyway. Raphael Bianchi, the man who hadn't shed a single tear since the night his mother died many years before, the man who had looked directly into the eyes of his enemies without ever flinching, suddenly felt something sharp and burning rise behind his sightless eyes, and he had to summon every fragment of control he still possessed to keep his face motionless, so no one would know that within that darkness, a man who had seemed to turn to stone was quietly beginning to melt. The following morning, before the first rays of sunlight were strong enough to drive the cold from the hospital corridor, Raphael heard the familiar sound of Vanessa's heels approaching, but this time she wasn't alone. Alongside them came the heavy footsteps of several men, the thud of leather briefcases being placed on a table, the rustling of thick stacks of documents, and the solemn, frigid atmosphere of a business meeting disguised as a visit to a sick man. He lay still, his face as expressionless as ever, while his straining ears recorded every detail, and he heard the dry, monotonous voice of a lawyer speaking about a power of attorney, medical decision-making authority, and the management and disposal of assets, each phrase falling into the room like a cold stone dropped onto the surface of still water. Vanessa spoke with the confidence of someone who had memorized the script and believed in it completely, saying that Raphael had prepared these documents in advance, that everything was legally valid, and that all they needed was one final notarized signature before everything would be settled. Then Raphael heard another unfamiliar voice reply that the notary was already present and ready. She had brought a notary into his hospital room, and in that moment, Raphael understood that this woman had planned everything before he had even awakened, arranging every piece with the cold calculation of someone who had no intention of losing. Yet the detail that stayed with him most deeply that morning came afterward, when the lawyers had left and only Vanessa remained with another woman, perhaps her most trusted assistant, and in the whisper Vanessa believed was discreet enough. She revealed something she never imagined would become the noose tightening around her own neck. Vanessa said that she had personally arranged for the night nurse to care for Raphael, that she had chosen that girl deliberately because she was desperately poor, had no connections, no influence, and no one standing behind her, just a small-town girl working herself to exhaustion through 2 shifts to survive. Someone who would never dare breathe a word of anything. She said a nurse like that was safe, easy to command, easy to dismiss, and most importantly, even if the girl happened to hear or see something, no one would bother believing the word of an insignificant nobody like her. Vanessa laughed softly as she said it, the self-satisfied laugh of a woman who believed she had sealed every opening, calculated every minor detail, and chosen the perfect harmless pawn to place upon her board. But lying motionless in the darkness, Raphael Bianchi heard something entirely different in those words from what Vanessa believed she had said, because he knew exactly who the nurse was. He knew the calm, unhurried voice that had read to him, and the warm hands that had cared for him the night before. He knew that the very person Vanessa considered the weakest, most harmless, and most disposable link in her entire plan might be the only thing in this room full of lies that was real. Vanessa had searched for someone who would never dare speak, and without realizing it, she had placed beside him a woman whose kindness came from instinct rather than calculation. Raphael understood that the move she believed was her cleverest, choosing a pawn that appeared useless, might become the fatal mistake that buried her. In the world where he had lived, where every act of loyalty carried a price, and every promise could be bought or sold, a decent person who had no idea whose side she was standing beside was the most dangerous weapon of all, a weapon that none of Vanessa's money could predict or control. Behind his sightless gaze, for the first time since he had awakened, a cold glimmer of hope began to kindle inside him, faint but sharp, because he had found the piece his opponent had unknowingly left unguarded. Throughout that entire day, while the outside world still believed he was nothing more than a breathing corpse lying there and waiting to fade away, Raphael Bianchi quietly began the most difficult work he had ever undertaken in his life. Work that required neither power, money, nor cunning, but demanded only one thing, the pure will of a human being. He focused his entire mind, directing every fragment of strength he still possessed into his right arm, trying to awaken the paralyzed pathways of his nerves, trying to send the simplest possible command from his brain down into his motionless fingers. For many hours, nothing happened at all. His fingers lay lifeless upon the white blanket as though they no longer belonged to him, and beads of sweat gathered across his forehead from the terrible effort no one could see. The effort of a man who had once commanded an entire empire and was now struggling merely to move a single finger. But Raphael had never known how to surrender, and he continued trying again and again, one attempt after another, patient and relentless, in the same way he had been patient throughout his entire life, while pursuing things others believed impossible, until at last, in a fragile moment that seemed almost too extraordinary to be real, the index finger of his right hand gave the faintest twitch. It was only a tiny movement, nearly invisible, but it was his, completely obedient to his will. He knew it wasn't enough. A random movement could easily be mistaken for an involuntary reflex, so he continued practicing, engraving that fragile pathway into his body until he could repeat the motion deliberately, tapping his finger against the mattress twice in succession whenever he chose. And when night fell, when the familiar soft footsteps of low-heeled shoes sounded once again beyond the door, and Cora entered the room carrying the old book in her hands, Raphael knew the moment had come. She sat in the chair beside his bed, as she usually did, opened the book, and began to read in the warm, unhurried voice that had become the only thing he looked forward to during those long and lightless days. He lay there listening, waiting for exactly the right moment, and when she paused to turn the page, he gathered every remaining fragment of concentration and tapped his index finger against the mattress twice, slowly, clearly, and with unmistakable purpose. Cora's reading stopped in the middle of a sentence. The room suddenly sank into a thick and heavy silence, and Raphael could hear the change in her breathing, could sense the sudden tension spreading through the air as she realized that what had just happened wasn't an illusion. He tapped twice again, making certain she understood that it wasn't an accidental reflex but a conscious signal. A message sent from a place where no message should have been possible. For one long and suffocating moment, Cora said nothing, and Raphael feared that perhaps he had placed his trust in the wrong person, that she might panic and run, call the doctors, and unknowingly destroy everything. But then he heard her place the book down with great care, heard the chair move closer to the bed, and her voice rose through the silence, trembling yet struggling to remain calm, so quiet that it nearly dissolved into the air, asking him to please do it again, if he could truly hear her. Raphael tapped his finger twice. He heard her draw a deep breath, the breath of someone who had just touched a truth far greater than anything she had prepared herself to face. And then, after another pause, she leaned closer and whispered in a voice barely strong enough to stir the air between them that she didn't know what was truly happening inside this room, but she had been quietly observing everything for the past several days, and she didn't believe that things here were what they appeared to be. She paused for a moment, then continued, saying that if he was deliberately remaining silent for some reason, she would protect that secret for him. And within the absolute darkness of that hospital room, between a man who couldn't see and a woman who had no idea whose war she had just stepped into, a silent pact was formed, as fragile as a breath, yet stronger than any oath. The following night, Cora returned carrying something besides the old book, a stack of paper and a pen, because throughout that entire day, she hadn't been able to stop thinking about the 2 taps of his finger in the darkness, about the man imprisoned within his own body who had still found a way to send a message. And she understood that if he had something he needed to say, then she had to find a way to listen. She sat beside the bed and softly told him that she had thought of a method, then patiently explained that she would recite the alphabet slowly, and when she reached the letter he wanted, he only had to tap his finger once. In that way, one letter at a time, they would form words, and those words would gradually reveal whatever he needed to tell her. It was an agonizingly slow process that demanded extraordinary patience from both of them. She whispered each letter, while he listened and summoned every measure of concentration he possessed so he could tap at precisely the right moment. And with every confirmed letter, Cora wrote it down on the page, her hand trembling with nervous anticipation. Letter by letter, the message slowly appeared beneath the dim light of the room, and when the first letters began to take shape, a chill swept down Cora's spine, because the first message the man sent her wasn't an ordinary plea for help, nor was it a question about his condition. It was a warning, 4 brief words that carried the weight of stone. Don't trust anyone here. She sat in silence for a long time, staring at the sentence on the page, and in that moment, every strange detail she had quietly noticed over the past several days suddenly came together into a picture that made her shudder. She had noticed the men silently standing guard in the hallway, men in dark suits who never took their eyes off the door to his room. She had noticed the dazzling blonde woman who always appeared with a flawless smile but eyes as cold as ice. She had noticed the lawyers coming and going with leather briefcases swollen with documents. And now, with those 4 words of warning before her, Cora suddenly understood that the motionless man lying in this hospital bed wasn't an ordinary patient. He was someone deeply important, immensely powerful, and perhaps just as dangerous. Real fear rose within her, because she realized that she had unknowingly stepped into a world she didn't understand, a world of deadly secrets where a poor nurse like her could be crushed without anyone ever knowing what had happened. She could stand up right now. She could fold the page, walk out of this room, and never return. She could ask to change shifts or transfer to another ward. She could tell herself that none of this was her concern and that she owed this stranger nothing. And for one moment, Cora truly considered doing exactly that. She thought of her younger brother waiting for her at home. She thought of a life that was already painfully difficult. She thought about how she didn't have the strength to carry one more burden of danger. But then she looked down at the man in the bed, at his motionless face and the eyes buried in darkness, and she thought about how terribly alone he must have been throughout all those days, surrounded by people who entered and left the room wearing false smiles and whispering calculated words, all of them merely waiting for him to die, with no one genuinely standing beside him. She understood that if she walked away now, he would once again be left alone in the darkness, abandoned to those who wore the disguise of love while waiting for the chance to destroy him. Cora Whitfield wasn't wealthy. She had no power and possessed nothing except her devoted hands and a heart that the cruelty of life still hadn't managed to harden. It was that heart that spoke for her, compelling her to place her hand over his motionless one and softly tell him that she wouldn't abandon him, that no matter who he was, and no matter what was happening, she would remain there beside him. And in that moment, she had no idea that the simple promise born from the pure kindness within her had just changed the course of both their lives forever. During the nights that followed, as their secret alphabet became the thread connecting 2 human beings, Cora began talking to him more and more, between the slow recitation of letters and the writing down of each message, not because it was part of her duty, but because she felt that within that quiet room, this man was the only person who truly listened to her. And little by little, the story of her life began to unfold in the darkness. She told him that she had grown up in a small rural town, that she had never known her father, and that her mother had been her entire world until a devastating illness took her away before Cora had even had the chance to grow into adulthood, leaving her not only with an immeasurable grief, but also with a mountain of debt from the hospital bills that had piled up, debts she was still bending beneath as she paid them off $1 at a time. She told him that after her mother died, she became the only person her younger brother, Aaron, could depend on, a bright boy filled with dreams, and that she had made a promise to herself with everything that remained inside her after so much loss, a promise that she would never allow him to grow up without love or be forced to abandon his education, no matter how much she herself might have to sacrifice. It was because of that promise that Cora worked herself to exhaustion through 2 shifts every day, the daytime shift at a small clinic and the night shift at this hospital, sleeping very little, eating whatever she could manage, and pouring every dollar of her meager wages into her brother's tuition and the debts that never seemed to diminish. The only thing that could still make her smile after those endless shifts was the sight of Aaron rushing to the door whenever she came home, throwing his arms around her and eagerly telling her everything he had learned at school, about the wonderful book he had just read, and about his dream of becoming someone who could one day make a difference in the world. She spoke of the rare evenings, when the two of them sat together beneath the warm light of their cramped little apartment, sharing a simple meal, and Cora said that all she needed was to see her brother's smile and hear his clear, innocent laughter, and every trace of exhaustion and sorrow inside her would disappear, because Aaron was the reason she kept moving forward through a life that had rarely shown her any kindness. Then, in a quieter voice touched with bitterness, she told him about the man she had once believed would walk beside her for the rest of her life, the man who had made her countless promises but turned his back and left the moment he understood the burden she carried. The moment he realized that loving a woman buried beneath a mountain of debt and responsible for raising a younger brother wasn't a sacrifice he was willing to make. He had disappeared without even saying goodbye, leaving behind a wound that continued to ache inside her, a wound that made her question her own worth in the eyes of others. Cora said that from then on, she had learned not to expect anything from anyone, had learned to carry every burden by herself, and had learned that the kindness she gave so freely had never seemed to be returned fairly by life. Lying motionless in the darkness and listening to every confession she offered, Raphael Bianchi felt something unfamiliar rising within his chest, because he, a man who had built an entire empire and possessed everything people longed for, was quietly beginning to realize that he and this poor nurse were strangely alike. Both of them were lonely, both had been betrayed by the very people they had trusted most. Both had learned to survive by closing their hearts tightly against the world. But while Raphael had used power and coldness to build walls around himself, Cora had chosen the opposite path. She had preserved her kindness even when life had given her no reason to remain kind, and she continued offering warmth even when she had so little left for herself. It was that enduring and selfless goodness, something Raphael had never encountered in the world of lies that had surrounded him all his life, that touched him more deeply than anything else ever had. In the darkness, he silently told himself that this woman deserved better from life, and that if he survived the storm closing in around them, he would make certain she finally received it. One night, after the conversations between them had grown more intimate, and Cora had begun speaking more openly about her late mother, she unintentionally mentioned a detail she could never have imagined would make the heart of the man lying beside her seem to stop between one beat and the next. She said that her mother had once been a nurse as well, and not an ordinary nurse, but a private nurse who had worked for many years for a powerful family in this city before she and Cora moved to the countryside and began living quietly. Cora explained that her mother had rarely spoken about those years, that whenever Cora asked about them, she would avoid the question or abruptly change the subject with a strange restlessness in her expression, and that it wasn't until the final days of her life, when illness had drained away nearly all her strength, that she murmured a few things in her delirium, broken fragments of memories about a wealthy family, a vast mansion beside the sea, and something terrible she had accidentally witnessed, something she said she should never have seen. Cora said that her mother had been suddenly dismissed after that night, driven out of the city with a sum of money and a warning that was never spoken aloud, and that for the rest of her life, she had lived beneath a vague and constant fear, always telling Cora to stay away from powerful people, to live quietly and remain invisible, as though she were trying to protect her daughter from a ghost of the past that she herself didn't dare name. Lying in the darkness, Raphael Bianchi listened to every word as an icy sensation slowly spread through his body, because each detail she described, The mansion beside the sea, the private nurse, the fateful night, and the way that woman had been driven away in silence, was coming together inside his memory to form something he had believed buried long ago. He remembered those earlier years, before he had fully taken control, when the Bianchi family was still fractured by internal divisions and quiet struggles for power that hadn't yet been settled, and he remembered a nurse who had cared for his father during the old man's gravest illness. A gentle woman who had suddenly disappeared from the mansion without anyone ever explaining why. Now, as those scattered pieces slowly locked into place, a horrifying truth began to emerge before him. The mother Cora had just described was that very nurse from all those years ago. The terrible thing she had witnessed might have been connected to a dark secret buried in the Bianchi family's past. A secret concealed not by Raphael's father, nor by Raphael himself, but by another force that had quietly found its way inside. A shadow named Bishop Cain, the man who had begun planting the seeds of his ambition to devour the Bianchi empire even in those distant years. Raphael remained motionless, his heart pounding beneath an expression that revealed nothing, as he realized that fate had arranged something no calculating mind could ever have devised. The young woman sitting beside his bed, the poor nurse Vanessa had dismissed as a harmless and nameless pawn, was actually the daughter of a woman who had once possessed a fragment of truth powerful enough to bring everything crashing down, and the blood flowing through Cora's veins had silently drawn her back into the very storm her mother had risked her life to keep her away from. Cora knew nothing of the invisible thread of fate binding her to this war. She didn't know that the man she was protecting was the heir to the family her mother had once served. She didn't know that the secret her mother had carried to the grave might be the key to everything. She simply continued reading, continued recording each message, and continued offering her kindness without the faintest suspicion that she was standing upon an explosive buried in the past. And for the first time in his life, Raphael felt a fear he had never known before. Not fear for himself, but fear for her, because he understood that if Bishop Cain or Vanessa discovered who she was, if they learned whose blood flowed within her, then her innocent kindness would no longer be a shield. It would become a death sentence. In the darkness, he silently vowed that he would protect her at any cost, even if doing so meant concealing from her the truth about her own origins. When Raphael understood that he couldn't remain motionless and wait forever, that every passing day brought Vanessa closer to her goal, he knew the time had come to bring his first piece into play, and the only person in the world he could trust completely was Silvio Marchetti, the elderly advisor who had stood beside the Bianchi family for nearly 40 years, the man who had once held Raphael in his arms when he was a child, and had watched him grow from a boy of the harbor district into the most powerful crime boss in the city. Through their secret alphabet, slowly and patiently, Raphael gave Cora a sequence of numbers and strange code words, a cipher known only to him and Silvio, a way to prove that the message truly came from Raphael and wasn't a trap. Then he instructed her on how to contact the older man as discreetly as possible, warning her to be cautious at every step and to make certain no one was following her, because even the smallest mistake could bring everything crashing down and place her directly in danger. Although her heart pounded with fear, Cora did exactly as he instructed, and during a rare break between her two shifts, she quietly found a secluded corner, called the number he had given her, and when a deep, composed male voice answered at the other end of the line, she nervously recited the code she had committed to memory. A long and suffocating silence followed, the heavy silence of a man who had just heard something he didn't dare believe. And then Silvio's voice returned, roughened by emotion, asking her again and again who had given her those numbers. When he finally understood that the man he had served was still alive, that the person the entire city believed dead was conscious and sending a signal from within the darkness, the elderly advisor fell silent for a long time before he was able to speak again. That very evening, Silvio arrived at the hospital under the appearance of an old family friend paying a visit, wearing the calm and respectable manner of a family attorney, convincing enough that none of Vanessa's men suspected a thing. When he entered the room, sat beside the bed, and took Raphael's hand in his own. Only a few soft taps of Raphael's finger were needed for the two men to understand each other, just as they had always understood one another throughout all the years they had shared. The plan for their counterattack began taking shape inside that silent room, and Raphael's first command wasn't to strike, nor was it to take immediate action. It was to remain patient, to wait, and to allow Vanessa to continue believing she was winning, because he understood that someone intoxicated by victory would become careless, would expose weaknesses, and would eventually reveal everything that needed to be brought into the light. He instructed Silvio to gather every piece of evidence in secret, to trace every movement of money, every meeting, and every signature, and to allow Vanessa and her accomplices to weave with their own hands the net that would eventually bind them, while outwardly, everything still had to appear as though Raphael were fading a little more with each passing day. During their discussion, Silvio revealed something intriguing that he had quietly observed over the course of the previous days. The alliance between Vanessa and Bishop Kane wasn't nearly as stable as it appeared. Beneath the surface, a deep current of suspicion existed between them, because both were greedy and ruthless, and people like that never truly trusted one another. Each was secretly guarding against the other, and each was calculating how to claim the larger share when the spoils of power were finally divided. Raphael listened, and within the darkness, a faint smile appeared in his mind, because he understood that the small fracture between the two conspirators might become the opening he needed to break their entire scheme apart. Sometimes, the most effective way to destroy two enemies wasn't to strike them himself, but to let them turn upon each other and tear one another apart. And when Silvio departed beneath the cover of night, carrying the first orders from the man he had served for so many years, Raphael Bianchi remained alone in the darkness, no longer a helpless victim waiting to die, but once again the man he had always truly been, a patient predator silently setting his trap and waiting for his prey to step inside. The first step of the trap was laid with such subtlety that no one realized it was a trap at all, because Silvio, armed with the wisdom of nearly 40 years spent navigating the criminal underworld, quietly allowed a rumor to spread into precisely the places where it needed to go. The rumor that Raphael Bianchi's condition had become hopeless, that the doctors had admitted there was nothing more they could do, that the man would never awaken again, and that it was merely a matter of time before he drew his final breath. The story was released carefully through the very people Vanessa still trusted, slipping through the channels of information she continued to rely upon, so that by the time it reached her ears, it carried the appearance of an undeniable truth rather than a carefully constructed lie. And just as Raphael had predicted, the moment Vanessa believed the last obstacle in her path was about to disappear on its own, she immediately accelerated everything, because once greed catches the scent of victory, it no longer possesses the patience to wait. She began rushing to complete her secret agreement with Bishop Kane. Their meetings became more frequent, their telephone conversations more urgent, and in that growing haste, she began making the very mistakes a calmer and more disciplined person would never have made. Silvio remained hidden in the shadows, watching in silence as he traced her every movement, and what drew his attention most of all was the flow of money. Enormous sums that had begun moving through a tangled web of accounts, laundered again and again through shell companies, all of them passing through the hands of a man named Desmond, the cold and greedy accountant Vanessa had hired to conceal every trace of her financial dealings. What Vanessa didn't know was that every transaction she made, every meeting she attended, and every signature she placed upon a document was being secretly recorded by Silvio, piece by piece. One fragment of evidence after another, carefully gathered and securely hidden like bricks, slowly building the wall that would one day imprison her. And as the trap tightened around them, something intriguing began to reveal itself beneath Silvio's watchful eye. The growing suspicion between the two conspirators, because although Vanessa and Bishop Kane had joined forces in pursuit of the same ambition, neither of them had trusted the other for even a single moment. Silvio discovered that Vanessa had secretly kept copies of every document for herself, evidence she could use against Bishop if he ever dared betray her, preserving it like a protective charm in case their alliance collapsed. On the other side, Bishop Kane was no more naive than she was. He had planted his own people close to Vanessa and was quietly gathering anything he might use to control her when the time came. Two venomous snakes were coiled together inside the same den, each believing it was clever enough to swallow the other before being swallowed itself, and neither of them knew that a third pair of eyes was watching silently from the darkness, recording every sign of fracture, every expression of suspicion, and preserving them as weapons to be unleashed at the most devastating possible moment. When Raphael heard Silvio recount everything through the soft taps of a finger beside his hospital bed, he immediately understood that this fracture would become the fatal weakness in the enemy's entire conspiracy, that once they were driven into a corner, two people who had never trusted each other would inevitably turn and betray one another, and all he needed to do was remain patient, continue playing the role of a dying man, and allow greed and suspicion to finish the rest of the work for him. In the darkness of the hospital room, the man who had once built an entire empire lay perfectly still, his face calm and empty of expression, but within his mind, Every move was being arranged with the cold precision of a master chess player, and he knew that even though he now stood in the weakest position of his life, this game would still end exactly as he intended, because his enemies were too busy counting the spoils of victory to realize that every step they took was carrying them closer to the abyss they themselves had dug. Late one night, when Silvio once again came to the hospital bedside under the guise of an old friend paying a visit, he brought news that caused even Raphael Bianchi, a man accustomed to controlling every emotion, to falter between one breath and the next. News that no calculating mind could ever have foreseen. Nico Ferraro was still alive. The loyal driver whom the entire city believed had vanished into the flames on that fateful night. The man Vanessa had confidently crossed off her list of concerns was still breathing, still hidden somewhere within the darkness of the city. In a low, rough voice, Silvio explained that on that night, Nico had sensed something was wrong, a vague instinct that those who had survived long enough in the criminal underworld learned never to ignore, because during the days before the explosion, he had noticed several unusual things. A few unfamiliar faces lingering near the garage, and small changes in the behavior of people he should have been able to trust. Because of those suspicions, Nico had quietly altered the plan at the last moment. He had arranged for someone else to handle part of the schedule that should have belonged to him, while he himself wasn't standing in the precise place the mastermind had calculated. When tragedy struck, amid the chaos of smoke and fire and the haste of those first conclusions, the identity of the unfortunate victim had been mistaken, and the entire city, including those behind the conspiracy, came to believe that Nico Ferraro was dead. But Nico hadn't died. He had simply disappeared. And within that disappearance, he had recognized an opportunity few men ever received, the chance to become a ghost, an invisible witness who could move among people who believed he had already been erased. Instead of fleeing to save his own life as anyone else might have done, that loyal man had chosen to remain, hiding within the forgotten corners of the city, watching in silence, following every clue, and slowly piecing together the truth about those who had tried to kill the man he served. He had followed suspicious meetings, memorized the faces entering and leaving places where they should never have appeared, and quietly gathered fragments of truth that only someone in his extraordinary position, a man believed dead by everyone, could possibly reach. As Silvio recounted all of this, Raphael lay motionless in the darkness and felt something he hadn't experienced in a very long time, a warmth mingled with painful remorse, because he understood that this man, who had nearly paid with his life for his loyalty to Raphael, was still risking himself in the shadows, not to save his own life, but to uncover the truth for him. Raphael also understood that Nico's survival had completely transformed the balance of the game, because Vanessa and her accomplices had acted under the belief that the most dangerous witness, the person closest to the center of the tragedy, had been silenced forever. That mistaken belief had made them careless and had caused them to leave behind weaknesses they thought no one would ever be able to expose. But that witness wasn't merely alive. He was actively hunting the very people who believed they had destroyed him, and that transformed him from a victim into a threat the enemy didn't even know existed. Raphael tapped his finger to signal Silvio, instructing him to protect Nico at any cost and to keep his survival absolutely secret, because the value of a living witness who was believed to be dead was beyond measure, and if that final advantage were revealed at the wrong moment, it would be wasted. Raphael understood that Nico was the missing piece capable of overturning the entire game at the decisive moment, the living evidence who could stand before those responsible and identify them without hesitation, and Raphael had to keep that card hidden until the very last second, until the moment Vanessa and her allies were completely certain they had won. In the darkness of the hospital room, amid the steady rhythm of the machines and the quiet breathing of the elderly advisor beside him, Raphael Bianchi felt for the first time since that fateful night that the scales were slowly beginning to tilt in his favor, because his enemies were playing a game without realizing that the pieces they believed removed were still on the board, intact and waiting silently for the signal from his hand. But just as the balance began to tilt in Raphael's favor, a new danger quietly rose from the very place he least expected, because Vanessa, though intoxicated by the feeling of victory, still possessed the keen instincts of a predator, and she began to notice something that troubled her. The night nurse seemed to be giving the patient far more attention than an ordinary nurse should. She noticed that Cora lingered inside the room longer than necessary. She noticed something in the way the young woman bent over the bed, a closeness and tenderness that Vanessa's suspicious instincts immediately recognized as unusual. One evening, just as Cora stepped out of the room, Vanessa stopped her in the middle of the corridor, and in her familiar sweet voice with a hidden blade beneath every word, she began questioning her, asking why she spent so much time with a patient who was in a coma, asking whether she had been prying into matters that had nothing to do with her duties. Then she delivered a threat disguised as concern, telling Cora that a nurse like her should know how to remain within her proper boundaries if she intended to keep her job. Although her heart was pounding wildly inside her chest, Cora managed to keep her face calm and quietly replied that she was only fulfilling her responsibilities as a caregiver and that she treated every patient with the same devotion. Yet Vanessa's cold, piercing gaze remained fixed upon her for a long time, examining and weighing her, as though she were trying to see through that gentle exterior and uncover whatever might be hidden beneath it. Then Vanessa added something that seemed to freeze the blood in Cora's veins. She said she would have someone investigate Cora's background more thoroughly, that she wanted to know exactly who this young woman was, where she had come from, and whether she had any suspicious connections. In that moment, Cora had no idea that the seemingly casual threat had come dangerously close to a secret that could cost her life. Because if Vanessa uncovered her mother's past, if she discovered the invisible thread connecting Cora to the Bianchi family and to the secret buried all those years ago, then Cora's kindness would no longer protect her. It would become her death sentence. But the danger didn't end there, because the following evening, when Vanessa entered the hospital room with Cora so she could personally observe everything, an incident nearly destroyed them all. As Vanessa stood close beside the bed, bending down to study Raphael's face with a cold and searching gaze, she spoke several cruel words, reminding him that he didn't have much time left. At that very moment, perhaps because he couldn't contain his anger at the woman's cruelty, Raphael's fingers gave the faintest movement, an involuntary response that escaped his normally unbreakable control. Vanessa, whose eyes were as sharp as knives, noticed the tiny motion, and she suddenly froze, her gaze fastening upon his hand as her voice hardened, and she demanded to know whether he had just moved. For one endless moment, the entire room seemed to stop breathing, and in that life or death instant, Cora was the one who saved everything. Thinking quickly, she stepped forward and calmly explained that it was merely an involuntary muscular contraction commonly seen in patients in this condition, a phenomenon that was entirely normal from a medical standpoint and didn't mean that the patient was regaining consciousness. She spoke with enough professional confidence to make the explanation believable, then gently repositioned Raphael's hand and pulled the blanket back over him as any nurse would, completely concealing the truth that was beating fiercely beneath his motionless exterior. Vanessa continued watching her for a long moment, suspicion still lingering in her eyes. But in the end, Cora's calm and seemingly clinical explanation persuaded her to set her doubts aside for the time being, and she left the room with an air of lingering unease. Only after the door had closed and the sound of her heels had faded into the distance did Cora finally release the breath she had been holding, her entire body trembling with fear, and she understood that they had just crossed the thinnest boundary between life and death, that the trap they were setting was every bit as dangerous as the one their enemies had laid for them, and that one more small mistake would be enough to bring everything crashing down. It was during those tense days, when every moment could mark the boundary between safety and destruction, that Cora began to realize something she hadn't dared believe, even as the signs slowly revealed themselves before her eyes. She noticed that sometimes, as she moved around the room, Raphael's face seemed to turn faintly in the direction of her footsteps, a movement so slight it was almost impossible to detect, yet enough to make her uneasy. She noticed that when she reached up to adjust the curtains so the light wouldn't shine directly upon the bed, something briefly changed in his expression, as though he could sense the shift in brightness, rather than merely hear the sound of the fabric moving. Then, one evening, while she sat reading beside his bed and happened to glance up, she caught his eyes partially open, and in the brief moment before he could close them again, she saw within them not the empty, lifeless stare of a blind man, but a gaze, a quiet attentiveness, a fully conscious awareness silently watching her. Cora's entire body seemed to freeze, and the book nearly slipped from her hands as countless questions flooded her mind all at once, because she suddenly understood that this man hadn't merely heard her throughout all those days, he could see her. He had been able to see her for some time, silently observing every gesture, every expression, and every moment when she had believed no one was watching. The realization sent a shiver through her as two opposing emotions rose within her at the same time, because on one hand, there was something strangely tender in knowing that throughout all those nights when she had sat reading, throughout all the moments when she had spoken and opened her heart, he hadn't merely listened but had truly seen her, had seen a woman the rest of the world had grown accustomed to overlooking, and within that silent gaze, there seemed to be a kind of appreciation no one had offered her in a very long time. Yet on the other hand, fear also crept into her heart, because she realized that she truly didn't know who this man was, didn't know what he had concealed from her, didn't know what kind of soul existed behind those eyes that had been quietly observing her, and if he had been capable of hiding a truth this great, of concealing his restored vision with such extraordinary skill, then how many other things had he never allowed her to see? She remembered the first 3 words of warning he had sent her. Remembered the men in dark suits standing guard in the corridor. Remembered the way Silvio appeared with the calm composure of someone accustomed to carrying deadly secrets. And she understood that the man she was protecting, the man she had sworn not to abandon, was far more dangerous than she had ever permitted herself to imagine. And yet, strangely, even after understanding all those frightening truths, Cora still didn't feel the desire to run, because in the gaze she had just caught, she hadn't seen a threat. She had seen something deeply lonely and strangely vulnerable, as though the powerful man hiding himself within the darkness, beneath all those terrifying layers, was still only a human being longing for someone to see who he truly was. When she gently set the book down and looked toward him with a new understanding beginning to awaken inside her, she felt the boundary she had tried so hard to preserve between nurse and patient, between a protector and a stranger, beginning to blur in a way she couldn't name and didn't dare acknowledge. She said nothing, and he didn't open his eyes again, but they both knew that something had changed between them in that quiet room, that an invisible bond had drawn a little tighter, and when Cora picked up the book and continued reading in a voice softer than usual, she understood that her heart was stepping into a place her reason had already warned her was dangerous. A few days later, something happened that violently shook the trust Cora had only just begun to place in him, because while walking by chance through an empty corridor during her break, she saw Silvio standing and speaking with Vanessa, and what stunned her wasn't the conversation itself, but the elderly advisor's manner. She saw Silvio nod at Vanessa with an expression of agreement, saw him smile at her with apparent warmth, and watched the two of them speak in the quiet, measured voices of people sharing the same hidden purpose. In that moment, an icy suspicion pierced Cora's heart. She concealed herself behind the corner of a wall, her heart pounding, straining to hear what they were saying, and the scattered fragments of conversation that reached her only deepened her fear. She heard Silvio mention documents. She heard him say something about everything soon falling into place. She heard Vanessa answer in the satisfied voice of someone who believed she had gained the support of an important ally. Cora felt as though the ground beneath her feet were collapsing, because Silvio was the person Raphael trusted more than anyone else. The first and most important piece they had placed into play, and if even he had betrayed them, if even the advisor who had served for 40 years had turned toward the enemy, then everything they had been building could crumble in an instant, and both she and Raphael were standing at the edge of destruction without even realizing it. Throughout her entire night shift, doubt tormented her without mercy, and she didn't know what to do. She didn't know whether she should tell Raphael, whether he would believe her, or whether he would think she had misunderstood what she had seen, and she continued struggling with herself until she couldn't bear it any longer. That night, when the two of them were finally alone in the room, she bent close to the bed and, through their secret alphabet, tremblingly told him everything she had witnessed. She described how familiar Silvio had seemed with Vanessa, repeated the words she had overheard, and confessed her fear that the person they trusted most had sold them out. She waited for panic, anger, or at least confusion, but instead, Raphael's fingers tapped the mattress with a slowness and calmness that seemed almost unnatural, and as the letters gradually formed into words, Cora began to understand a truth that left her both relieved and astonished by the depth of calculation behind every move this man made. Raphael explained that what she had seen wasn't betrayal, but part of his own plan, that he had ordered Silvio to approach Vanessa deliberately and to make it appear as though he were considering joining her side, so he could gain her trust and draw out information she would only reveal to someone she believed was an ally. He told Cora that in the world where he had lived, sometimes the only way to discover what an enemy was planning was to make them believe you stood beside them. And Silvio, with nearly 40 years of hard-won experience, was the perfect man to play such a dangerous role, a spy standing in the very heart of the enemy, while the enemy mistook him for a friend. Cora fell silent when she understood, ashamed that she had doubted him so quickly, yet once again deeply aware that she was moving through a world where nothing was ever what it appeared to be. a world where loyalty could wear the face of betrayal, where betrayal could disguise itself as loyalty, and where every step was a move in a game she had only just begun learning how to see. And as she looked down at the man lying motionless in the bed, she realized that the mind concealed beneath that frail exterior was still working with astonishing coldness and precision, arranging every person, every situation, and every lie, like a master player controlling the entire board, while everyone else could see only the few pieces directly before them. As the trap continued tightening around them, a new fracture suddenly opened in the very place Raphael had been patiently waiting for, because the suspicious streams of money Vanessa had moved through the hands of her accountant, Desmond, had finally drawn the attention of federal investigators. And once the sharp eyes of the law began following that trail, it was only a matter of time before the carefully constructed financial network started to crack apart. Desmond, a man accustomed to hiding behind columns of numbers and believing himself safe beneath layers of shell companies and tangled accounts, began to panic when he realized that the investigators were drawing dangerously close, that his name was slowly emerging from the mountain of records he had believed were perfectly concealed, and that if everything came to light, he, not Vanessa or Bishop Kane, would be the first to suffer the harshest consequences. Silvio, with the instincts of a man who had spent a lifetime sensing fear from a distance, immediately recognized the opportunity and quietly approached the trembling accountant, not with threats, but with an offer no drowning man could refuse. He made Desmond understand that only two paths remained before him. He could keep silent and die beside the people who had used him, and would gladly discard him the moment he ceased to be useful. Or he could turn back, cooperate, and reveal everything he knew in exchange for a chance to survive. Desmond had never been a loyal man. He was merely a greedy opportunist who knew how to calculate profit and loss, and he chose the second path with little hesitation, because his instinct for survival told him that clinging to a sinking ship would be the most foolish thing he could possibly do. When the accountant finally began to speak, what he revealed sent a chill even down Silvio's spine, a man who had witnessed nearly every form of cruelty during his long life, because Desmond possessed more than evidence of the dirty money, the secret agreements, and the entire plan to seize the empire. He also held the darkest missing piece, the one that had remained an empty space within the picture for all this time. Proof of who had truly ordered the attack on that fateful night at the harbor. Through Desmond's confession, the truth was finally exposed in all its naked and merciless horror. Vanessa herself had given the order. She had coldly arranged for everything to happen at that exact time, on that exact road. And what made the truth even more horrifying was that she had known Nico Ferraro would be there. She had known that the loyal driver would most likely pay with his life, yet she had accepted it without hesitation, treating him as an insignificant cost, as nothing more than a pawn that could be sacrificed upon the chessboard of her ambition. When Silvio recounted all of this beside the hospital bed, Raphael lay motionless in the darkness, and although his face remained as calm and unreadable as ever, a storm was raging within him, because he now possessed not only evidence of betrayal and proof of the conspiracy to seize his empire, but evidence of a brutal crime, proof that the woman to whom he had once intended to entrust his entire life had been willing to murder innocent people simply to obtain what she wanted. He thought of Nico, of the man who had nearly died because of his loyalty to Raphael, and he silently vowed that the price Vanessa would pay for this crime wouldn't be limited to the destruction of her ambitions. The entire truth would be dragged into the light of justice. With Desmond's confession carefully recorded and added to the growing collection of evidence, the final piece of the picture had fallen into place, and Raphael knew that the moment he had awaited for so long, the moment when he would overturn the entire game, was closer than ever before. All that remained was to wait for precisely the right instant, when everything would erupt at once. In the days that followed, Raphael's health gradually improved enough for the doctors to move him out of intensive care, and although his body remained weak and he still had to sit in a wheelchair because his legs couldn't yet bear his own weight, being able to sit upright, move his hands by himself, and feel small traces of strength slowly returning was already a quiet victory in the far greater battle he was secretly fighting. And it was during one peaceful evening, when the two of them were alone in the new room, that Raphael decided Cora deserved to know the truth, or at least part of it, because she had risked herself for him, protected him, and placed her own safety inside this war without asking for anything in return, and he couldn't allow her to continue walking through the darkness without understanding who the man she was shielding truly was. In a voice still rough and weak after so many days of silence, With the first words he had ever truly spoken aloud to her, he slowly told her who he was. He told her about the Bianchi name and everything attached to it, about the hidden empire stretching across the city's harbor, about the power, the enemies, and the dangerous world he had ruled for so many years. Cora sat in stunned silence as she listened, and the shock on her face was impossible to conceal, because although she had vaguely suspected that this man was dangerous and powerful, she had never imagined the true scale of what she had become involved in. She had never believed that the man she had read to every night, the man whose hand she had held in comfort, was one of the most powerful and feared figures the city had ever produced. For one moment, as the truth crashed over her with almost unbearable weight, part of her wanted to rise and run from all of it, to return to her simple and safe life, and to pretend she had never stepped into that fateful room. But when she looked into his eyes that no longer pretended to be blind before her, and now met her gaze with raw sincerity, she realized that behind all the power and danger was still the lonely man she had gradually come to understand and care for, the man who had quietly valued her in a way no one else ever had, and she understood that she couldn't turn her back and leave. Not because she was afraid, but because something deeper had taken root inside her heart, something she no longer wished to deny. She gently placed her hand over his, and with her eyes, she let him know that she would remain, that no matter how frightening the truth might be, it wouldn't change the promise she had given him. That night, when her shift ended and Cora returned to her small apartment beneath the late evening lights, the door had barely opened before Aaron rushed toward her and wrapped his arms around her, his young face glowing with happiness as he told her about his day, about the test he had done well on, and about the new book he was still reading. His clear laughter filled the small room with warmth, driving away, if only for a moment, all the tension and danger she had carried through the long day. Cora held him tightly, feeling the warmth and peace that only this humble home could give her. And in that moment, she understood more deeply than ever why she had to remain careful, why she had to protect this small and precious world of hers at any cost, and why she had to keep it far away from the darkness she was entering. As she sat beside her brother beneath the warm light, listening to his innocent stories, she silently prayed that the storm ahead, the storm she knew was drawing very near, would pass quickly so she could return completely to peaceful moments like this one. The day Vanessa believed would mark her complete and final victory eventually arrived, and she chose to hold the last signing ceremony inside the hospital room itself, as though she wanted to savor her triumph directly before the man she believed she had utterly defeated. She entered with the bearing of a queen on the day of her coronation, magnificent and filled with confidence, followed by Bishop Kane, wearing the sinister smile of a man about to devour the prize he had coveted for so long, and a group of lawyers carrying leather briefcases swollen with the documents that would formally transfer the entire empire into their hands. The air inside the room was thick with the arrogance of people convinced they had already won, and after ordering the lawyers to arrange the documents on the table, Vanessa approached the wheelchair where Raphael sat motionless, his head slightly lowered, his face still bearing the quiet resignation of a man who had surrendered everything. She bent close to his ear, and in the poisonous whisper she believed only he could hear, she delivered her final cruel words, telling him that he had lost, that everything he had spent his life building was about to belong to her, that he should have simply died that night at the harbor and spared everyone the trouble, and that she had never loved him for even a single moment, but had only ever seen him as a step she could use to climb to the summit of power. She smiled as she spoke, the smile of someone who believed she stood at the very top of the world, certain that the man before her was nothing more than a ruined shadow, incapable of fighting back. But the instant those venomous words left her lips, something happened that froze the smile upon Vanessa's face, because Raphael Bianchi slowly raised his head, and then he opened his eyes. They weren't empty and lifeless as she had believed. They were bright, fully aware, and as cold and sharp as two blades, the eyes of a predator who had waited patiently through all those long days for this precise moment. He looked directly into her face as the color drained from it in horror, and in a voice that was still rough but steady and terrifyingly cold, he said, "The paperwork is finished, Vanessa, but it isn't the kind of paperwork you think it is." The entire room seemed to fall dead silent for a moment that stretched into eternity. The lawyers froze with their hands suspended over the documents. Bishop Kane's expression changed instantly, and Vanessa stumbled one step backward, her eyes widening as she struggled to believe what was happening before her, unable to accept that the man she had been certain was blind and dying was sitting there awake, alert, and watching her with the gaze of someone who controlled the entire game. At that exact moment, the door burst open, and Silvio entered with the calm bearing of a man who had waited a very long time for this instant, followed by federal agents in formal attire, warrants in their hands and stern expressions upon their faces, flooding the room within seconds. Vanessa spun around, her face shifting from horror to panic as she realized this wasn't a coincidence, that every detail had been arranged, and that the trap she believed she had been setting had closed around her long ago without her ever knowing it. She stammered, trying to deny everything and grasping desperately for excuses, but it was already far too late, because every piece of evidence Silvio and Raphael had patiently gathered over those long days was now being brought into the light. The dirty money, the secret agreements, the recorded testimony, all of it came crashing down at once like a raging flood, drowning every possible path of escape. Raphael sat upright in his wheelchair. He didn't raise his voice, and he had no need for violence. He simply watched in silence as the woman who had betrayed him struggled inside the very net she had woven with her own hands, and there was no triumph in his eyes, nor any wild and consuming hatred, only the cold stillness of a man who had waited far too long for justice and was now watching it slowly take shape before him. She had entered the room as a victor, bending over the man she believed had fallen so she could deliver one final humiliation, but now she was the one standing unsteadily at the edge of ruin, surrounded by the truth she had worked so hard to conceal. And the storm Raphael had quietly nurtured in the darkness for so long had finally arrived in full force, sweeping away everything she had plotted and everything she had hoped to claim. As the room descended into chaos and the handcuffs were about to close, something unexpected happened that made the situation even more dramatic, because Bishop Kane, who only moments earlier had stood beside Vanessa as her ally, immediately revealed himself as the opportunist he had always been the instant he sensed approaching ruin. Without a second of hesitation, he turned against the very woman with whom he had woven the entire conspiracy, hurriedly declaring to the federal agents that he was prepared to reveal everything in exchange for leniency, that Vanessa had been the true mastermind, and that he was merely a pawn she had drawn into her scheme. Yet, in his frantic attempt to find a way out, his own mouth inadvertently exposed a truth far greater than anyone had imagined, that Vanessa herself was only one link in a much larger network, that other forces stood behind her, pulling the strings, feeding her ambition, and using her as a tool to seize the Bianchi empire from within. The hidden fracture between the two conspirators that Silvio had discovered long ago, the suspicion they had both tried so carefully to conceal, now burst apart into open betrayal, and exactly as Raphael had predicted, once the two venomous snakes were driven into a corner, they turned upon each other, each desperately trying to drag the other into the abyss in order to save themselves. But even Bishop Kane's frantic confession couldn't rescue him, because at that very moment, a piece from the distant past unexpectedly returned to close the circle around them, a piece no one in the room had anticipated, not even Cora, who stood silently in one corner watching everything unfold. The evidence Silvio had worked so tirelessly to gather didn't end with the crimes of the present. It reached back to a secret buried many years before, and the testimony of a gentle nurse who had accidentally witnessed a crime inside the seaside mansion. Testimony for which that woman had paid with the peace of the rest of her life, suddenly became a crucial link connecting Bishop Kane's faction to the crimes of the past. Cora stood frozen as she gradually understood that the nurse from all those years ago had been her own mother, that the secret her mother had carried throughout her life in fear, the terrible thing she had accidentally seen, had finally become the very piece that helped bring the people who had destroyed her life into the light of justice. Cora felt as though her mother's hand, reaching from beyond this world, was still quietly protecting her and guiding her forward. Then, just when everyone believed the moment had reached its conclusion, the door opened once more, and a figure stepped inside that left both Vanessa and Bishop Kane frozen as though they were staring at a ghost, because the man standing before them was none other than Nico Ferraro, the loyal driver they had been certain had vanished in the flames at the harbor. Nico stood there in flesh and blood, alive and fully aware, his eyes fixed upon the people who had attacked the man he served and had nearly taken his own life, and his presence, a living witness the enemy believed they had eliminated, became the final blow that shattered every remaining hope of denial. Faced with Nico's detailed testimony about everything he had quietly uncovered, the mountain of evidence tracing the dirty money and secret agreements, the confession of the accountant Desmond, and Bishop Kane's own betrayal, Vanessa finally collapsed completely. There was no escape left for her, and no lie powerful enough to save her. She was arrested on the spot under a mounting list of charges, including conspiracy to commit murder, financial fraud, and money laundering. And alongside her, Bishop Kane and the other conspirators were placed in handcuffs one after another. An entire criminal network that had been painstakingly constructed over many years was finally brought down in a single afternoon. And amid all the chaos, Raphael Bianchi remained quietly seated in his wheelchair, watching the justice he had patiently awaited finally take shape, not through violence or blood-soaked revenge, but through the complete truth being brought into the light. When the storm had passed, and the entire truth had been brought fully into the light, Raphael Bianchi didn't rush back to his empire, didn't hurry to reclaim his power or secure his position. Instead, the first thing he did, as soon as his health allowed, was visit the modest home of Nico Ferraro's family, where the loyal driver had finally been reunited with the people he loved, after long days spent living in the shadows like an invisible ghost. Raphael sat there in his wheelchair, surrounded by the laughter and warmth of that simple home. And he didn't speak about money or compensation. He spoke instead of his profound gratitude, of the rare loyalty Nico had shown him, and of his promise that from that day forward, Nico's family would always be protected and would never again have to go without anything they needed. Outside in the yard, the children played beneath the warm afternoon sun, their clear laughter ringing joyfully across the small patch of ground, and that peaceful scene, so far removed from danger, ambition, and calculation, made Raphael suddenly realize that this was what truly deserved to be protected, the very thing whose value he had nearly forgotten during a lifetime spent pursuing power. When a journalist approached him with the hope of telling the entire story, Raphael agreed without hesitation. But he asked that the story not revolve around him, not around his empire, the conspiracy, or the downfall of his enemies. He wanted it to tell the only part that truly mattered, the story of a poor nurse who had sat beside a stranger without knowing who he was, who had read books aloud to him, protected him even when doing so might have cost her everything, and had done all of it not for money or recognition, but simply because it was the right thing to do. He said that was the story worth telling, the story of pure kindness in a world crowded with lies, and that if there was one thing he wanted the entire city to remember after everything that had happened, it was the image of an ordinary human being who had chosen compassion when no one had required it of her. Then, on a peaceful evening, Raphael went to Cora's small apartment, not as a powerful crime boss, but simply as one human being coming to another, and there, around a modest dinner she had prepared with her own hands, he witnessed a quiet kind of happiness he had never known throughout all the years of his life. Aaron smiled brightly as he told Raphael one story after another, his clear eyes filled with innocent trust, while the little room overflowed with the warmth of a true home. Sitting in the middle of that scene, the man who had once built an entire empire, who had possessed the power and wealth so many others desired, finally understood a simple truth he had nearly died before learning, that true victory in life didn't lie in power, revenge, or defeating one's enemies. It lay in humanity, in the ability to preserve kindness and sincerity within a world that constantly tried to wear them away, and in finding someone who would remain beside you with a genuine heart and without calculation. Raphael looked at Cora, then at Aaron's innocent smile, and silently promised himself that from that moment forward, he would learn to live a different life. Not the life of a cold and distant crime boss hidden behind walls of power, but the life of a man who knew how to treasure what was simple, honest, and real. And in the end, that was the most ambitious plan he had ever made for himself. If this story has touched your heart in some way, if you also believe that kindness and compassion still possess the power to transform even the harshest and most tragic of destinies, then please subscribe to our channel, press the like button, and share this video so you can continue joining us each day for many more meaningful and compelling stories. We would truly love to know how today's story made you feel, so please don't hesitate to leave a comment and share the thoughts and emotions that come from deep within your heart, because every word you offer is a precious source of encouragement to us. Thank you for listening to this story until the very final moment. We wish you and those you love abundant health, a joyful and peaceful life, and days filled with goodness and blessings. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next videos.